Welcome everybody to the afternoon session. This paper or talk is about controlling meta control. Mainly work jointly with Max Mittenbühler, who's in the US right now, so I'm giving the talk. We really want to see controlling meta control is really about the question, how do we direct our thoughts? How do we control our habitual behaviors and our planning behavior? So it's really about these two things, habits on the one hand side, that what we do without thinking about it much, basically, many automatic behavioral processes in our minds, and on the other hand, the planning side, where we have to think in detail about what we want to do next. Habits, right, can be defined something as learning of a policy pi, a reactive policy that's a density over actions. In a particular situation, my density over actions tells me, okay, just do that. Yeah. So it can be done with standard policy-based reinforcement learning, like Q learning, and it yields a system that acts stimulus-driven, right? So a policy pi is nothing else. As a given a stimulus, I have a density over a response. If I'm greedy, I just choose the best response over that density. On the other hand, planning, right, is forming a planning tree with some form of expansion algorithm, some random search, some greedy search or something, which yields a tree of potential future developments, like integrating action choices along the branches. So choosing actions to move along. The traditional example of planning, right, is chess playing, for example, or so, right? I basically see, okay, should I move there, should I move there? And if I'm an expert in chess playing, I have maybe a little bit of a hunch, yeah, I should try if I get this way around to attack the opponent or so, right? So it yields a system that acts fully goal-directedly, but it's costly, right? So the big difference between the two, on the other hand, right, on the one hand side, habit learning is a system that thinks fast, acting reactively, and if the policy is good and very smart and has evolved over time or developed over time, it's very clever also. But it's not very flexible. One habit for one thing, if the situation changes, the habit might break down. On the other hand, the planning system is a very flexible system. It's a system that thinks slow and acts slow, but is very flexible on the other hand. Yeah. So, due to this two systems view originated by Kahneman, as I put in the previous slide, we have a kind of a nested meta control problem, though, right? The question is basically when do you act according to your habit and when you plan. So when planning, the agent has to determine which branches to explore as well. So that's another tricky business. And so the decision-making accounts for system choices and planning tree expansions. It kind of needs to decide, okay, do I want to plan and how do I plan? And in traditional approaches, this is quantified as an approximation of an expected utility, which weighs the cost of doing that planning and expected uncertainty reduction as the profit of this planning cost. So you essentially have the problem that you need to know, okay, how much uncertainty reduction will I have due to my planning behavior? And that's a real problem because this estimating of this uncertainty reduction, in the end, I have to do the planning to be able to estimate uncertainty reduction because how do I know it beforehand? So the question is really to efficiently compute this expected utility without doing the planning itself, which you just want to decide on how much of which you should do, basically. So in the literature, you find heuristic approaches to this, back up to 20 years. Peter Dyer, Neve, and others have worked on this intensively, and steps-limited planning and others. But all these approaches have either they need to do the planning itself to make the decision, or they rely on some form of heuristics, some form of estimated rewards that kind of come out of the magic hat. Yeah? There's not a real clear approach how to do this properly. And we believe an approach that does this in an integrative way, where habits and planning together essentially emerge from one inference process formalization. That inference model infers in turn priors over actions, which corresponds to habits, and then goal-directed posterior distributions, which are inferred by doing a limited amount of planning, and the system tracks on the fly while it's doing this its overall goal, which is essentially the minimization of surprise, and we will look at this formalization in a second. So the goal-directed posterior distribution via the planning is generated via planning, and this is, in our case, a goal-directed sampling process. So it's like Monte Carlo tree search, essentially, that is, you can also call a model predictive control approximation or model-based reinforcement learning approximation. It starts from a prior distribution and then accepts those samples that seem to satisfy the agent's current goals. So it's a kind of rejection sampling, closely related to Gibbs sampling also. And the execution of an actual action then is triggered via the goal-directed posterior. And then the action outcome is tracked, observed, and the result is then used to determine a particular, what we call a contextual frame posterior, which is nothing else as fine-tuning the habit to the situation at hand. So we propose essentially that this process combines habit learning and planning in approximately optimal manner. And now I will show you in more detail how this really works, since some of you I've lost probably right now, so I will give you quite a concrete example how this actually functions. Yeah? So let's take the Stroop task as an example and the main model that I will focus on in this talk. Right, so we all know the Stroop task, probably I've heard of it. To reminder, right, you basically you have to press a right or a left button, for example, if the color that a word is written in is red or blue. Yeah? So let's say you press left when it's red and right when it's blue. So in this case, right, you have to press the left button, right, because it's written in red, although it reads blue, and so it's an incompatible trial. Because right, you see the blue, right? You read the blue, and it's really hard to realize, oh, it's it's red here. Yeah? So sometimes you press a button here. I portray it as a button. Sometimes you have to also verbalize it. That's even a little bit harder than because you really want to read that blue that's written there. Yeah, although you have to say red, which is much harder. So in order to model this now, we essentially propose now this graphical model that models this inference process. And this graphical model has two main components to it. It's basically this inner part. This is the modeling, the actual trial-by-trial decision-making process, which we call the contextual frame. And it has this outer part, which is essentially the context, or the inference of the contextual frame itself, which sets the priors over this internal contextual frame. So this internal contextual frame, like over one trial, you essentially see the stimulus, the observation of the stimulus O1, and you perceive it in S1, so interpreting it, well, I read blue, but it's written in red. Yeah? However good you can do this. Out of this, you can make a habitual behavioral actions choice, which is tuned by alpha, which is essentially a conditional probability table of A given S1. Yeah? And you have the task situation, which is controlled by beta, which basically says, well, given stimulus S1 and A, is my answer correct? So did I press the right button or the wrong button, essentially? Yeah? So in this case, as we said, the color is red, so I should press left, right? So if it's red here, the color, and the action was press left, then S2 is the belief I did it correct. Yeah? And if I press the wrong button, then it's the belief of doing it incorrect. And O2 is essentially the observation of the outcome, so the signal if it was really correct or incorrect. Notice that beta, which is also controlled by the context, essentially gives the conditional probability table of when you are correct, so essentially the knowledge of the task. Yeah? And gamma is your goal. Gamma is essentially your desire to act according to the task. So if you put gamma to nearly 1, then it means like you want to be perfect in this task. Yeah? If you put it to 0.9, you say, yeah, you want to do it good, but in 10% of the cases, if I fail, it's also okay. Yeah? So that's basically gamma. Yeah? So notice how the context now essentially defines your mental state. It's basically your decision-making process, your internal decision-making problem itself. It gives you the reward. Yeah? The gamma is the goal, how good you are, how value it is for you to be correct. Beta is the knowledge about the task, and alpha is your habitual priors, how you act reactively about stuff. Yeah? So it essentially is in itself now an MDP problem, in a sense. Yeah? So, and that MDP problem is continuously fine-tuned by this contextual inference process that works on the outside of the inference. So basically, there are two main model inferences unfolding. The one is basically the action decision-making process. So when you have a stimulus, to decide which action you take, you do predictive sampling, and doing rejection sampling, we reject or we accept only those samples that are according to our goal-directed prior or are matching with that goal-directed density that we have. And then we basically fine-tune this action by this. And then our action posterior then leads to my action choice. So for example, the maximum probability of choosing left or right, basically. Let's take the maximum then. Or I could do an epsilon greedy here still or something like this. And then I do the context adaptation, which is essentially the inference of adapting alpha, beta, and gamma. Yeah? So the contextual state sets these priors over stimulus, over habits, over task sets, and of task focus. And when in this frame, tri-specific decision-making unfolds. We can formalize all of this now based on an equation that is now a little bit complicated, but it's essentially derived out of just the goal of minimizing surprise in the near future of the system. This equation essentially boils down, and it's an upper bound of minimizing surprise, so it's an elbow equation essentially, which is also closely related to free energy formalizations of this. But it doesn't really matter. You can derive this equation directly from this graphical model and from the general task to minimize surprise. And so this loss, this tri-loss that you have essentially, consists of two main terms, and that can be interpreted as error and a cost term. The error is essentially here, we remember that observation goal that you want to achieve. You're essentially the error of doing the task wrong or correct. So this is the error of doing it correct or incorrect, depending essentially on your prior gamma, how much you really want to do it correct. So the more you want to do it correct, the more costly it is to have the log probability here. Not according to what you expected or what you want to happen. And the second one is the scale divergence. And this is just the divergence over densities. Yeah? It's just the divergence over these internal estimation densities A, S1, and S2. This is how you perceive the stimulus, which action you believe you do, and the S2, which you believe of the outcome. And the cost essentially now, notice, is like the divergence between two probability densities. The one that takes into account that your goal, that takes your goal into account, so your desire to do it right. And the other one is just basically taking the stimulus into account, so how you act reactively to in the current situation. So this is your prior density without planning, and this is your posterior density after planning. Yeah? So that means essentially it's the more you plan, the more costly it becomes because your density changes more. So the more you change your densities, your inner beliefs, essentially how you should do this task or what you should do in the end, the more costly it becomes for you. Yeah? And so you have a trade-off, right, between doing more planning to avoid the error, yeah? And the cost involved of doing this planning, which is changing these internal densities due to your planning updates. And this plays out really nicely in such a way that one can simulate the Stroop task very, very well. And combined with the context inference, right? So notice this was now basically just for one trial, right? Error cost and how much should I plan in one particular trial given my priors. But I also want to update my priors. I want to infer the context itself. So I basically do the same equation, yeah, do the same experimental loss, but I combine it with a trial loss, so the error and control cost, basically, plus the cost of changing the context itself, which encodes the prior densities. So over trials, I change my contextual prior densities in such a way that I minimize my trial loss, basically. Yeah? So the whole thing is basically designed to minimize energy spending while acting according to my desires. Yeah? Mm-hmm. And the result that you get out of this is now within a trial, essentially sampling simulates information gathering for decision making. And we look now how this decision making unfolds. So here we basically have the action belief change in percentage points. So I start with 0 belief change. This would be my reactive behavior. And the more I sample, the more belief change I have. And notice that the belief change, the more belief change, it gets somewhat exponentially more costly. So it's the cost of sampling, and that is generating belief changes. If I have sampled a lot already, we all know, right? If we have done a lot of statistics already, more data doesn't help me that much. So to get the same amount of belief change, I need to sample more and more data, and sampling more and more data is more and more costly for me. So this is the cost, essentially. And then we have as green the negative reward, which is avoiding to be incorrect. So the more I sample, the less likely it becomes to get negative reward, to do it incorrect. Yeah? And the combination of this red and green one are the blue ones now with low reward and high reward. So in low reward case, if it's not so important to me to do it right, I essentially do not need to do as much sampling because I'm okay if I do a couple of more mistakes. And if it's high reward, so I want to do more correct, it takes me longer and it's more effortful. And if you do this sampling now over trials, and the nice thing about this is that the system can monitor this change in these cost functions, these dynamics essentially over trials, over time, without computing the closed form posteriors. But the sampling, when we reach the plateau, when we get to the plateau of having no more gains versus costs, is actually, this is the density that you get, and these vertical lines are the closed form posterior, basically. So the sampling can be shown to approximate the closed form posterior optimally, basically, yeah? Or more or less exactly. So you never have to calculate the closed form posterior. It's just samples it and basically approximates the closed form posterior very well and acts thus very efficiently and with minimal energy spendage. Yeah? And as a result, basically, we can simulate the standard Stroop task very well. So if you have mostly congruent trials, it's well known that you have the proportional congruency effect, essentially, that if mostly congruent trials, you have a much larger congruency effect, right? So in terms of an incongruent trial versus a congruent trial, versus when it's mostly incongruent, right? Because you essentially are ready to ignore the word much better. And that exactly happens also with our model, but only when you do this contextual inference as well. So if you have a habit learning that basically you react faster to the word than to the color of the word, then you get the congruency effect, but you don't get the proportion congruency effect because you need to account for the proportionality of the blocks of tasks. And if you do this via the context inference with these equations that I've shown you, then you also account for the proportion congruency effect. And interestingly, the nets, so the amount of information energy that you spend, is only minimized in these tasks when you indeed do the contextual inference besides the behavior habit learning as well. So we can show that only when you do this contextual inference umbrella, doing decision-making per trial within and adapt the context over time as well, we minimize the decision-making energy, and only then we also simulate the human behavior. To come to an end, we also did a nice other experiment, Max, with a team project over last year where you have like a maze that looks like this. You have 3 decision-making points and 8 planned in total. And also for this task, you essentially can show that with a contextual inference, you mimic the behavior of the human participants best, and also also minimize your energy really well. But maybe this is a little bit too much detail. In conclusion, I wanted to show you today really that habits and planning can go hand in hand. When facing a task, basically a graphical model of a causal chain is needed to do the inference process or to guide the inference process. And this graphical model came out of nowhere right now, but it essentially reflects the task structure and the task situation. And in the end, I would say our mind infers the graphical model that's currently at stake. Yeah? When I give a talk, when we go for lunch, whatever, it's graphical scripts that are at stake and within which we behave and act. These models encode essentially contextual frame thus as densities which determine prior conditional probabilities, and a template of the process, which is the causal predictive graphical model structure itself. And the inference process then, out of given that model, is doing partially planning-informed action choices via habitual policy initializations, and then optimizing this via sampling actions and resulting outcomes, essentially doing planning. And optimization of a habitual policy is then accomplished via the context inference, and so basically we have it now all together. Habits are optimized over time, initialize the planning, and planning knows how long it should plan given the habitual situation and the task at hand to come to a decision. And hopefully that was not too complicated. Thank you for the attention.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so my name is Viktoria. I work in the Institute of Cognitive Science in Osnabrück, and today I'm going to talk about familiarity memory in spiky neural networks. Yeah, I'm doing a bit of low-level modeling. I hope all words will be pretty clear during the talk. So, thank you. Probably the first thing which we should do is define what is familiarity memory. Usually when we think about memory, we first think about recall, which is a conscious directed retrieval of specific details of a memory. But familiarity is a different form of memory, well understood as opposed to recall, because it's very quick, automated feeling of whether something is familiar to us, aka whether we have encountered it before, maybe many times or a few times. And familiarity has a range of pretty important critical functions. So, for example, we can think of it in the context of biological or artificial agents exploring the environment. If the object or location seems familiar, familiarity signal can guide us to explore other locations more, or if this is a new location or a new unexpected stimulus, maybe we have to facilitate some plasticity and learning mechanisms to memorize it further. So it is very helpful in the behavior adapting to changing environments, and some people interpret it from the point of view of predictive coding, where familiarity is likened to predictability of the stimulus. There is one short important classification. Usually people study relative familiarity, which is a shorter term familiarity signal on the experimental time scale, like if I have seen something very, very recently or not. But I'm more interested in the absolute familiarity, which refers to lifelong memory. So in all my prior experience, how well I'm familiar with this or that particular stimulus from the environment. Okay, so I would like to try to answer 3 main questions in this presentation. First of all, well, how can we encode this familiarity? Or in other words, which properties must the system possess to be able to encode familiarity? Then, of course, another natural question is, how can we facilitate this encoding? How exactly this process works? And finally, how we can later retrieve it from our system. Yeah, let's imagine a simple spiky neural networks, because that's the type of networks I'm working with. They're a bit different from ANNs. They're more brain-like. Maybe we can talk about it in more detail later. In such networks, neurons communicate with discrete spike events. They interact over time, which is pretty important. But OK, so let's go directly to our first question. Where is familiarity information encoded in such networks? Yeah, and the answer is pretty obvious from the title of the talk. It is encoded in recurrent connections between the neurons. Yeah. So how exactly does this work? Let's say we stimulate some group of neurons in our network which form strong horizontal connections to one another. Let's say we stimulate them, give some familiar input. It can be pretty random, some random spiking events. And we can tell that this input is familiar, aka it activated a group of neurons which represent this familiar memory. This results in the synchronous activity, synchronous firing events of neurons in the system. So we can say that spike synchrony of the network can be sort of estimates the matching between our external input, external stimulation, and the existing recurrent connectivity, which encodes our prior experiences. So this leads us directly to the first study. We did a simulation study with a V1-inspired spiky network, which had neurons which form recurrent connections with each other, and every neuron had orientation and spatial selectivity. And in V1 and in our model, likewise, the connectivity is organized the following way. Neurons with similar selectivity form strong connections to each other. So essentially, when we perceive some continuous contours, they tend to activate groups of neurons with strong connections between them. And as we know, or as we hypothesize at this point, the activation of a group of neurons with strong recurrent connections will lead to synchronous firing activity. So that was our hypothesis. We're expecting that in such a setup, the activation of neurons forming a continuous contour would lead to synchronous activity, and vice versa. Yeah, maybe a couple of words about how we measure synchrony. We use a metric called rsync. What it measures essentially is how the variance of spike train of every individual neuron in a group is similar to their together average variance over time. So essentially how close to each other they're firing in a temporal sense. And our results essentially confirmed our hypothesis. We had 2 experimental setups, two sets of stimuli. So the first set of stimuli, we activated less and more continuous contours, and we can see the effect is not super pronounced, but it is here. It is significant that the activation of more continuous contours leads to more synchronous firing activity. And likewise, for orientation similarity, when the contour is more similar, then the neurons tend to exhibit synchronous firing. All right. So let's move on to the second question. How do these recurrent connections emerge in the system? How are they shaped? So as I said, we have a recurrent spiky network. We maybe have some random spiked input delivered to the network. And honestly, the answer is kind of obvious. We know from multiple biological observations that in the brain, there can be different specifics in the plasticity mechanism, but in general, these recurrent connections are shaped by some this or that form of Hebbian learning. This is this infamous rule, neurons that fire together, wire together. So that's how these recurrent connections are formed. And here we wanted to showcase this in another modeling study. We already didn't have a pre-built recurrent connectivity. We first initialized networks with some random connectivity between the neurons, and then we were delivering various stimuli to a network, which means we were stimulating different groups, different clusters of neurons, right? And there was some sort of Hebbian plasticity going on all the time, always active. And this Hebbian plasticity essentially acts as a mechanism to memorize all incoming stimuli, right? To embed them into the internal memory representation system in our recurrent connectivity. So we did it on the example of a continual familiarity task. I lost my mouse, doesn't matter, which was first represented in the study that you can see on the slide, meta-learning synaptic plasticity. So continual familiarity setup. We show different stimuli to a network. As I said, Hebbian plasticity is going on, and some inputs are present in the data set once and some twice. And the important part is when some inputs are presented in the data set for the second time, there is a fixed amount of distractors between them, between two familiar stimuli. Right? So, for example, I present stimulus A, so activate some group of, externally stimulate some group of neurons, then show 5 other random stimuli, and then stimulus A again. This would correspond to a parameter repeat interval, and that would be equal 5 in this case. Okay, and the task which our network was tasked to do was to detect whether every incoming stimulus is familiar or not. So whether we have already encountered it R time steps ago or not. And yeah, so important thing is, as I said, we have the main hypothesis that we can retrieve this information using spike synchrony, but we also wanted to do a control experiment, which is here on the left panel, familiarity readout, which means that, honestly, I'm talking about spike synchrony as if it's a well-established thing. It is quite a well-established thing, but many people still have doubts about whether it's important, whether it is encoding some crucial information about the system, for example, about familiarity, or it is just an insignificant byproduct of brain activity, right? So we wanted to do a control experiment and also test another encoding scheme. What if we don't have to detect familiarity from spike synchrony? Maybe we can detect it from something simpler, like just the amount of spikes that every neuron produces, so just from the firing rate. So with our control. Okay, in the second experiment, yeah, okay, I will try to explain it briefly. So as I said before, we fixed the amount of distractors between every two familiar inputs in the data set, but honestly, this kind of memory would be kind of boring. How useful is it to detect familiar stimuli exactly 5 time steps in time? Sounds kind of lame. So we tested it across other values of the repeat interval parameter. As I said, we had some Hebbian plasticity going on, right? Here you can look at the equation on the right side. And it's just an equation which regulates how exactly these connections are shaped, right? And the equation is the evolution of this equation is governed by several parameters. It doesn't really matter what they are. What is important is there are several parameters, and we can fix their values. So we fix the values of this parameter, which allow us to most efficiently decode familiarity for a certain repeat interval, right? For a certain amount of distractors between two familiar stimuli in the data set. And then we test the network with the same plasticity mechanism with this fixed set of parameters on the other values of the repeat interval to see how well it generalizes over time. I think it will be a bit more clear on the results section. So yeah, just remember our two conditions. We try to decode familiarity information from spike synchrony or from the firing rate. And we wanted to see how well it generalizes over time. So here on the x-axis, you see the test repeat interval values. So yeah, the shape of the curve would definitely tell us how well it performs for every step in the past. And ideally, we would like it to be completely horizontal, but yeah, life is not fair, life is not perfect. And then orange line corresponds to the performance of the firing rate or spike count based familiarity classifier. And the blue line, or greenish one, I would say, more corresponds to spike synchrony performance. As we can see, our hypothesis was not exactly confirmed. Here, the firing rate performed better than spike synchrony. Okay, this kind of defies the purpose of everything. Does it mean that spike synchrony is garbage and I need to finish my talk right now and here? Actually, no. So the thing is that during our experiments, we made one very important assumption, which doesn't exactly correspond to how the real brain works. But I mean, I guess it was a kind of expected thing to do it, because that's how, I don't know, maybe 95% of modeling experiments in spiky networks are also structured. When we talk about retrieving familiarity, or to be fair, any kind of information from a recurrent system, as I said, we have a spiky network, and then we deliver a random external stimulation to some subset of neurons, right? And usually in such modeling experiments, we fix the intensity of this external stimulation and just use it all over the experiments. But as I said, that's not how the brain works. Brain perceives dynamic change in environments, and the same stimulus can be, for example, very well visible, have very good saliency, very high contrast, and in this case, neurons which are processing this kind of stimulus would receive very high intensity, very high rate stimulation. But the same object can be way less visible, have less contrast, or maybe we were not paying attention, and in that case, the external stimulation would have very low firing rate, very low intensity. And our assumption was that, well, if we vary this intensity of the external stimulation over time, then output firing rate might not be very precise anymore. But then when we look at the literature for spike synchrony, we can see that spike synchrony was only shown to be sensitive to recurrent connections. It shouldn't care about the intensity of the external stimulation. So maybe its strength is at being this robust to the intensity of external stimuli, because it's mostly sensitive to recurrency, which encodes familiarity. Oh yeah, and also we added some inhibitory connections into our model to a bit balance its activity. I mean, it's just technical details. So working with spiky networks, we assume that maybe it would also help us to make the performance a bit better. Yeah, here we go into the third study, and as I said before, remember, like, our main goal is still to classify new from familiar stimuli. Here are left and right column, right? But now we have another dimension to our inputs. As I said, can be, the top line corresponds to very salient, very intense stimulation. You can see this is a very high input firing rate, or it can be very low because it may be low contrast or low attention or something. In this case, we get weak, non-salient, not very intense input stimulation. And we hypothesized that, well, it would be very easy to distinguish between top left and bottom right conditions, because top left would both lead to very high firing rate and high firing synchrony in the network, and the bottom right would lead to low firing rate and low synchrony. But these other conditions, when the input is new, so we don't know it, so we stimulate some not strongly connected, very weakly connected cluster, but the input is very, very intense. This could boost our firing rate. But if the stimulus is familiar, so if we activate a strongly connected group of clusters, but the intensity is low, it would still, then our firing rate would be boosted due to this recurrent connectivity, and we would not be able to distinguish between these two conditions. But spike synchrony doesn't care about input firing rate, as I said before. It mostly cares about recurrent connectivity. So we assume that it might help us to distinguish between stimulus familiarity in these two salient and weak conditions. And this indeed was the case. Okay, here we have the results. We have two lines. Maybe I'll first go with the first one. This is a bit simpler. So we deliver stimulation to some subset of neurons in our spiky network. But we measure spike synchrony or firing rate in the entire population, not only the small stimulated subset. In that case, we can see that if you look at the most left picture, that when we increase this saliency variability of the input, both firing rate and spike synchrony decline, and firing rate even works a little bit better. But when we measure spike synchrony locally, only in the stimulated group of neurons, so which will correspond to the specific memory representation encoded in recurrent connectivity, we can see that spike synchrony doesn't care at all, exactly as we assumed, about input rate variability. It remains mostly sensitive to input familiarity reflected in recurrent connectivity, not in how intense it is, which makes it a more reliable classifier. I think it's even more clear from the distributions of spike synchrony and firing rate or spike count. For here, dash distributions represents new input, and the solid distributions represent familiar inputs, and we can see that synchrony doesn't, as a familiarity detector, does not care about the how variable, how salient the input can be. It will still can distinguish very well between these two classes, while firing rate is sensitive to both aspects of the input stimuli, and thus the representations of familiar and new stimuli become more and more overlapped with very saliency. Yeah, so this also inspired us to make one more small additional experiment. Here I need to explain a couple details. So as I said, we have recurrent connectivity, and we added some inhibitory connections. We just kind of, we know that in the brain, connections are usually more sparse than artificial neural networks. We don't connect all to all. Some neurons connect, many neurons don't connect at all. So we just try to have a look at different connectivity configurations with different levels of sparsity. On the y-axis, there is a sparsity of inhibition, which is balanced in the model. And on the x-axis, there is a sparsity of these recurrent excitatory connections, which encode familiarity. And the top line is a perform of familiarity classification, familiarity detection with firing rate. And on the bottom line is the performance of spike synchrony for the same task, familiarity detection, right? And we can see that spike synchrony has reliably, quite consistent, good results across many, many different realizations of connectivity, which means it can function pretty well as a familiarity detector in very different kinds of networks, including very sparse, very energy efficient ones, which is good. Whereas firing rate becomes less and less reliable. It has less optimal connectivity configurations with which it can work well, and it also doesn't work well at all when we have to memorize many patterns. At the same time, when we don't only want to perform to figure out if the pattern is familiar, but we also want to do maybe some object detection, some more complex task to say what kind of pattern that is, spike count or firing rate is a super reliable classifier regardless of input variability or something else, whereas spike synchrony is frankly pretty bad. So it means that it's not that either spike synchrony is a good code or maybe firing rate is a good code. They both can be very useful codes, but they just encode different information. So we can treat them as rate and temporal coding can be treated as complementary information channels in the brain. So firing rate tell us about of the population, can tell us about the identity of the stimulus, while spike synchrony provides, I would say, additional meta information about how familiar we are with the stimulus. Let's just quickly reiterate the results of every study to draw the conclusions. So spike synchrony reflects absolute familiarity, in other words, the matching between the external input and the recurrent connectivity. So it is encoded in recurrent connections. This encoding happens via ongoing Hibben learning mechanisms, and we can retrieve it with spike synchrony. I think, yeah, that is it. Thank you for your attention.